As the Russian studies scholar in our department of Slavic and Eurasian, I feel it's appropriate for me to go last. We were intentional in that order. I want to discuss a little bit Russian reactions, and these are fairly sketchy observations. A lot of the sources that I thought I had been erased, so that's part of the story too. Okay, so in terms of, this is probably a place to start. I can imagine you're all seeing all these things in the news and thinking, what's happening in Russia, right? How are people responding? Probably the first thing to realize is that there is virtually no coverage of the war on Russian television. In fact, the words war and attack, assault are not used. I have a link here to a news story that was published. I've seen throughout the Russian internet memes taking Tolstoy's War and Peace and saying special operation and peace. Or the reverse, because the Kremlin is presenting this narrative as we're going to Ukraine to restore peace because there's so much violence already because of the Ukrainian army. And we're going to, and I don't want to repeat this particularly a whole lot, I don't want to dwell on their narrative, but the reverse of these memes has also been special operation, or war and special operation. So special operation takes both war and peace. And that was a reference to Tolstoy's novel for you all. Most independent media have been shut down. This is a crackdown that's been happening for years. So there's very little free flow of information. And I will say, in advance of this presentation, I talked to some Russian friends that are local and in the United States who gave me information that they have through their scattered networks, right? We're getting this information piecemeal. Facebook Messenger might be like the only way. Or, I don't use Telegram, but that is kind of how we get information. Because whereas the conflict on the Ukrainian side is very public and happening very openly, everything on the Russian side is completely silent, except for some things that we do know. So what I'm hoping to do is kind of share some things that I've heard from private friends, and then I also will talk about broader reactions from professionals and also just broader things that you're also seeing. But I want to start with the point that there is no coverage. And I've heard Russian friends make jokes in reference back to the Soviet Union saying, well, we're surprised they're not putting on the ballet, because usually when there were a lot of problematic things happening in the Soviet Union, the television set tended to play the ballet. And so, just to distract people. But the control of mass media, control of mass information in Russia has been happening for years, probably leading up to this, right? Or not, it's hard to tell. So the Echo of Moscow and TV Rain, those are two main channels. And this is this is in Russian, but basically it tells you that TV Rain and Echo Moskvy, Echo of Moscow, have both been blocked. These were kind of the two core streams of information. And they are now gone. In terms of other reactions, we know of around 10,000 Russians who have signed letters against the war. This is from Meduza, which is another, they're both in and out of Russia, but they're another really valuable source of information. But I'm putting this to you in Russian for you because I want to show you something. The title just says that in Russia and throughout the world, there are many people against the war, and then it tells you that there's 10,000 people. But this little second paragraph here says that this information is coming from a source of information that has been considered a foreign agent in Russia, right? So Meduza, Echo Moskvy, TV Rain, all of them have to make this little disclaimer, making it clear that they are not, that they're a foreign agent, right? I have a list here. So let's see if I can actually click on it. Hold on. I'm going to try to go to this link real quick. But this is a list of different professions. Let me see if I can do it. I was working earlier. This is Medusa. They're partly in Russia, and see here again, this information is coming from, so you can imagine being a Russian being like, oh, do I trust this, right? But you can see here, all this lists. These are people who have written professions. So I'll focus a little bit on the mathematicians in a second, but you can see historians, Belarusian cinematographers, students, directors, groups and groups of people who've written community letters, translators, young teachers, theater workers, journalists, of course, but all of these people who've signed these letters. Let me see if I can go back to presentation mode. Here we go. And then, of course, we have protests throughout Russian cities. Let's see if I can. And so do you see here, this website, where this video was initially stably held? It's now gone. So all we have is the Twitter.
Yeah, fine, yeah.
So this is in St. Petersburg.
Yeah, fine, yeah. 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 Yeah, fine, yeah.
Okay. But already there's cleanup happening. And I want to talk about that in a second too. So these protests, and there was very early on an anti-war statement. The Novaya Gazeta is probably the biggest independent newspaper in Russia. It is still hanging on. Many of you probably know Dmitry Muravyov, who was the Nobel Prize winner in Russia for the incredible work that Russian journalists have done to get out the truth about what's happening. He made a statement in which he said, Novaya Gazeta is against this war. We stand against this war. We stand with Ukraine. And he also then did some interviews with TV Rain in which he said, I'm devastated. This feels like the end of our future. I'm devastated. I see no hope based on what's happened here. And the only thing we can do is create an anti-war movement in Russia that comes together, that stands against this. So there was a link to his statement that is now gone. But because Novaya Gazeta is no friend of the Kremlin, they also make it clear that the information here was removed by the requests of the Russian government. So that's what the Russian text there. They want to make it clear that they were forced to remove this. They also were one of the only newspapers to call it war. And they were doing that up until earlier this week. And now they're saying special operation. Because if you read you read TASS, which is the Russian official news agency, they say this is a special operation of surgical precision only attacking military sites in Ukraine, which is false, obviously, but this is their version. And so anytime people call it something other than that, it's a problem. And Novaya Gazeta has also now begun to call it a special operation, but with an asterisk to say, we are doing this at the request of the government. And that's kind of the most that they can do. One question that I know many American friends and Ukrainian friends have is, why aren't there more protests in Russia? I think it's a good question. But I also want to break that down for you. There's tremendous fear of reprisals. There are new crackdowns on protesters. Beyond that, there's a broader question of whether protest is how you change anything at all in Russia, because this isn't a participatory government, right? And people saw in Russia what happened in Belarus, where there were millions of people on the street, and, well, they were arrested, and Lukashenko is still in charge. But this question of why aren't there more protests is, I think, important. And I want to talk about it as objectively as we can. This is the amount of people that were arrested who went to protests. I read an interview with a Russian sociologist who was there in a protest in Moscow, who had a concussion. And he said that for Russia, for the kind of violence that these protesters face when they go out, as many people as we've seen is a good sign for now. It's not enough. It's nowhere near enough. But you also have to be aware of the fact that because there is no information in Russia, because this is all a special operation of surgical precision, and people watch all this falsity on their television, and that's their main source and often only source of information, the process of raising awareness in Russia is much slower than everywhere else in the world. So to the extent that I would like to see more protests, I mean, from the Midwest, the safety of the Midwest, I would like to see more reactions. You know, I'm hopeful that maybe we can see more over time. But even the sanctions, like they're feeling those slowly, in the sense that banks don't necessarily have cash to give out, or mortgages aren't happening, but it's happening bit by bit. And I want to talk a little bit about people who actually do support Putin, but not extensively. But these are kind of the arrests, and most of them are in Moscow and St. Petersburg, where we had the biggest crowds, arguably also in the regions. The riot police are less violent. This is a really pernicious thing. There were these children, these Russian children with posters saying no war, no to war. And they were held, or maybe 9 or 7, 8. They were held in the police. Their parents terrorized. They were not protesting. They were holding a sign. They were children. There are laws in Russia about protesting, right? One requires permission. These protests aren't, sanctioned protests. So everyone who stands there is taking a risk. And there was another one. Let's see if I can click on this. This was a little bit more recently. So now, with all the main news sources being more or less embargoed, YouTubers have actually become a really good source of information in Russia. So there's this YouTube video. This is in
Постановление правительства Санкт-Петербурга от 13 марта 2020 года номер 121 о мерах по противодействию распространению нового коронавирусного инфекции COVID-19, постановление главного государственного санитарного врача Российской Федерации номер 9, номер 15, санитарных и технологических правил.
That was March 1st, and I think I saw some YouTube video yesterday. There were some people just standing, and they were put into a truck because they weren't just walking, they were standing. So I would say the kind of Kremlin police state is increasingly flexing its muscles right now, pretty intensely, both to crack down on any information, like even things that were published last week are now no longer allowed. Of course, they also hide all this, right? These are the Russian fatalities. These are all the Russian losses that they don't talk about. But I had an opportunity this morning to read a statement and translated it. This is a letter from 450, maybe 350 Russian mathematicians against war, and it's to President Putin, so you can kind of see there, it's addressed to President Putin. But they talk about, And it's really interesting as an academic to read this, right? Because they're very much writing it as academics, as scholars, and saying the standards of living in a country have to do with the level of science we have. We can't be scientists if, we're in a rogue nation. And they call Russia a rogue state in this letter, and they talk about the violence that the Russian army, and I'm not including the whole statement, and I can share it with you if you're interested, want to try to write something about it, but they refer to Russia as a rogue state in this letter to Putin, and they talk about what this is destroying the future for the country, the future that they're all working towards. I don't know that they'll get a response, but this is one in that list of letters of people and scholars saying we're here, and also just recognizing that they work with Ukrainian scientists together and that they can't possibly advance science while their colleagues are being harmed by the Russian army. And they're very specific that it is the Russian army that is doing these things. I also want to share, these are more private things that I got from people. These are colleagues of mine in the area. These are professors. And the first one says basically, I know what lies ahead. It will take decades for Russia to return to a place of marginal decency as a country. I wake up in the morning, and for the first time in my life, I don't want to wake up. And then the second one, again, just waiting for more repression, but also their supporters, those who watch TV, and I'm going to get to that in a second. This is just a letter of Russian writers. I won't necessarily click to it right now, but many, all the writers, the artists, they're all taking a stance. But I wanted to kind of bring up the mathematicians because it was different. It's a range of groups, doctors, professionals of all kinds. And then I want to get to this final piece, which there are also people who support it. I think that number of people is increasingly getting smaller and smaller. So to come back to the question of why there aren't more protests, all the repression, all the things that I'm showing is part of that, the fear. There isn't a whole lot of civil society, there isn't a lot of sort of protest organizations. Anyone who's tried to rebel has either been killed or arrested, right? So it's very problematic that there isn't a lot of structures in place to facilitate resistance right now. And the people that do go to protest, and I've heard from a couple people who had protested, are also, they're frightened of what will happen to them. And they're also they're very angry at the larger groups of people who don't respond. And I think part of what's happening here is that the people being attacked in Ukraine, they're not clinging to normalcy anymore, right? They're fighting for their lives. And in Russia, because of all the disinformation, I think there's still some small semblance of, well, let's just live our lives and watch TV, focus on the immediate, right? Not think about it. There's some way to maybe not think about it. And the tremendous fear of repression. And also people who actually support it, who believe that Putin is there trying to, bring peace, which is, inaccurate, but there are people who only get their information from state TV. There's also rampant anti-American sentiment. I watched some Russian on Twitter taking a hammer and breaking his iPad to say, screw America, I'm going to break my iPad, right? Because it feels like the sanctions are punitive, and a lot of Russians saying, well, whatever, it's not like I ever used dollars, it's not like I've ever had dollars, we'll survive, we'll weather this. But a lot of this is just disinformation, right? The people that I talk to the most are academics, they understand what's happening really well, they're against it. To the extent that, but they also, at the same time, even as they go and protest, they know that nobody cares about their protests. I mean, they go, but they know that what is the purpose, what will it do, right? And everyone sort of, there's an eagerness for some kind of change. I think some people believe that maybe the peace discussions can lead to something, but many people also were very concerned about the threat of nuclear war, and how that was launched right before how Putin made that threat right before the peace discussions. And, people taking their kids out of school, not feeling safe, letting them go to daycare, things like this. And again, it's all piecemeal and anecdotal because sources of information are really just unstable and websites disappear. So I'll stop there and see if you have questions.
We do have one online. Oh, go ahead. Let me get you the mic, though.
So the obvious, like when we talk about these letters of people that have signed, the obvious, like the reason that seems so significant to me is that those people are, they're putting their names on this, whereas, a protester could do so anonymously. Do you know if there have been people that, that have been arrested over that? Do you know if there have been academics or other people in other professions that have suffered arrest as a result of signing those letters?
Yeah, so I was gonna try to, so I'll give you one example. There was a Russian journalist, Elena Chernenko, who was a special correspondent to the Kommersant Daily. She's a well-known journalist, and she came out against the war, and she was put on leave shortly thereafter. So, I don't know that they're going to arrest them. I think for the professionals taking that stance, it's more they would be removed from their jobs or leadership positions, whatever they have. And I've heard that anxiety from colleagues, and also just, I would also say academics, who have students who go to the protests. That's another sort of really hard situation. And again, I don't want to compare, it's really hard because we're seeing what's happening in Ukraine, right? It is a life and death matter. But here, there's still some semblance of kind of quote unquote normal life, right? A lot of shame also, but a lot of semblance of attempt at normalcy. And so within that context, these risks appear larger than they do, when there's war.
The online question is also related to journalism. So the question is, if the only source of information is state-sponsored media, how do universities and other supposed free-thinking spaces function day to day? You mentioned that there were other forms of media that once existed but have been shut down or censored. Relatedly, what's the role of independent journalists in Russia, especially now?
I think being a journalist are endangered species in Russia, I would say. This is why Muravyev was given the Nobel Prize, because him and his people, but when he did his Nobel Prize speech, he talked about his colleagues who had been shot down. Anna Politkovskaya, for instance, right? She went out there breaking the truth about the Chechen war, and so yeah, I think it's really hard. It's really hard for universities. I know I can share from my personal experience when I've gone to talk about potentially, when I've gone to talk in Russia, I have not talked about queer topics, for instance, because there was the anti-homo propaganda law. And so that if there were a minor in the audience by accident, one could get arrested, or get in trouble in some way. And in general, get the people who invite you into trouble, right? So it's a kind of, it's complicated. There's just this kind of fear, right? And if you think about how long these people have lived with this kind of repression, which has been, and I think during COVID, the government has been increasingly using COVID to crack down more. They arrested Alexei Navalny, right, who was the only kind of credible opposition leader. He was never allowed to run for office. So cracking down and creating this sense of fear and dread among people to, you know, and to just suppress civil society, suppress resistance already.
Okay, another question from online. What can be done about the influx of the anti-Russian attitude in America? How can that be addressed? Shouldn't it be anti-Putin, not anti-Russian?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good question. Obviously, this is not a participatory government, right? These decisions are made within the Kremlin, by Putin probably, because even a Security Council looked vaguely confused and unclear. They weren't following what was being done, right? So it's not ordinary Russians who are making these decisions. Now, to the extent that you want to blame people for not standing up and resisting, I mean, again, this is a very repressive country. It's hard. And certainly Russians who are abroad have nothing to do with anything. Even Russians who are there, right? Their choices are to protest and get arrested versus not protest and get arrested, right? We can want to see more resistance, more out, you know, just more people speaking out with the awareness that we can make that statement from the safety of the Midwest. You know, and it's not the same thing there, right? But I think those are the choices, is to resist or not. They're not making these decisions. It's not Russian people who are, you know, a lot of them have deep ties to Ukraine. I didn't actually talk about that, so let me just say something about that. Because this is Ukraine, Russians and Ukrainians have deep ties, right? These Russian mathematicians are talking about their Ukrainian colleagues. They have friends, family often in Ukraine. I told a couple of Russian colleagues, I said, well, they're bombing apartment buildings in Kharkiv, you know, the special operation. That's what they're doing. Their children. And so, you know, I think their concern, it was interesting because I wanted to hear, like, is the concern about kind of what will happen to Russian economy, blah, 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 all these things. I think it's more just what's being done to Ukraine and the people that they know and the connections that they have. That seems to be the strongest reaction I hear. There are others, I'm sure. There's financial reasons, I'm sure. But I don't think those have fully trickled down yet. I think now it's just kind of what they see, and that it's Ukraine. I mean, it's Ukraine, it's Kyiv. And these places are very close to them. And so I think that's where a colleague sent me this exchange that they'd had with someone who was sort of pro this. And just, it's interesting to see them kind of push back and say, no, Ukrainians aren't fascists. Like, what are you talking about? This is not what's happening. And then that other person coming back and saying, well, surely this must not be what you say to your students in the classroom, because it's unpatriotic, right? It's just a constant, like, inner sort of, but it's interesting to see the battles just between people themselves.
This next question is asking you to speculate, just a heads up. So, do you think a coup might occur to overthrow Putin? Why or why not?
I mean, again, I also tend to think that, I think it'll mean a lot to a lot of people to see mass protests in Russia. But I'm not sure that that's how, I don't know. I don't know that that's how you see regime change, because I think we saw Lukashenko withstand millions of people on the street, right? Even strikes. So I don't know. I don't know how we see a coup. I don't know how it happens. I think part of the challenge is that there is no, because anyone who's been sort of a competitor politically to Putin has been removed. It's hard to imagine, like, if we were going to see a regime change, who the next quote-unquote successor or leader would be, because, you know, that would probably be the model we would expect. I mean, again, we're speculating. I will say I've worked on this region for 11 years, and as late as Wednesday of last week, I said to a large audience of people, this will not happen, this cannot happen. Because this is how absurd I think it is, that it, you know, it makes no sense. It's harming. You know, Russia is harming itself catastrophically by trying to destroy Ukraine. So so I don't know what the future brings. I mean, the one thing that I always like to watch for, because again, it's not a homogeneous sort of single entity, right? It's not the Kremlin. Not everyone is inside the Kremlin, right? You've got people, it's a massive country, and I've been trying to sort of hear about what's happening in the regions. Is there more resistance in the regions potentially? I would say some of the regions that are kind of ethnically different, like places like Tatarstan, probably are feeling some anxiety right now. In the Volga region, because they're different, and they are concerned that there will be a special operation in Tatarstan too, to take care of any concerns. So they're very cautious. And we saw fewer, you can see in the slide I had, there were fewer, numbers of people arrested. I think the protests were probably smaller, because you also have to think about access of information and whatnot in the regions. But I could see sort of unrest building up, separatism. We have a lot of separatism in Siberia, for instance. It's been there over time. You could see kind of that unrest and pieces breaking off, even, of Russia. I mean, we don't know. It's really hard to speculate. I don't think there's been an event like this. Even during the Soviet Union, there was not this kind of violence. And certainly toward Ukraine. I mean, it's unprecedented. So it's hard to speculate.
Thank you. I don't have any more online at the moment, if anybody here wants to. Thanks, Danny. So the comment about how, we shouldn't engage in anti-Russian sentiment per se made me think of the news reports I've seen about certain people in the American right valorizing Putin, and I've read some think pieces about like Mike Pompeo and Christian nationalism and somehow creating this like Christian world dominance situation. I'm a professor of religion, so I'm always going that angle. Does Putin care? And so I've also read about the sort of historic conflicts between the Russian and Ukrainian Orthodox churches. Does Putin care about religion, or is he using religion as a sort of aspect of Russian cultural dominance, or is that all too simple?
No, I think it's a really interesting question. So I think part of it is that he's seeking to advance a kind of civilizational model, right, of Russia as this kind of traditional Christian power that would be an alternative to the immoral, progressive West. Right? I mean, that's put in really simple terms, right? The strong Christian model and so it's very Christian-based. Some of it is also partly influenced by Christian right people who went there in the 90s and kind of influenced it a little bit and gave it a certain flavor. At the moment, I've been very dismayed with the reactions I've seen from the patriarch, who is, very close, so they're part of the same kind of power circle. And so I found, he made a statement against violence in which he talked about they were all brethren Slavs and this was fratricide. And I found this really problematic because Putin erased the idea of Ukraine in his speech basically last Monday. And said that we are just the same nation. So I thought that rhetoric was deeply problematic. And again, sort of blaming evil external forces, that's code for the West. But I do think that this war of civilizations, has a religious component to it. And I think this is kind of how they also persuade people, right? We're standing up to the West. Like the guy breaking the iPad, right? I know, seriously. It's also probably made in China, so this just seems really stupid as an act of protest. But I think, now whether Putin is actually devout, hard to tell. I think it's about power more than religion. And I think it's about using the church as a way to kind of legitimize himself and all the things that he's doing.
Any other questions?
There's a question right here.
I just have a question about like we're talking about Eastern versus Western civilization. So like, do you think the economic sanctions that the West is putting on Russia is going to be enough? Or do you think that like, if things continue to escalate in Ukraine with the Russian army, do you think like military pushback from either the United States or, you know, the UN or NATO or anything would be, I guess, like an option? Or do you think that would be kind of like needlessly, more needless violence?
You know, I don't know, right? It's not for us to say. And I do think right now, it's hard because, right, if NATO steps in, then it becomes a larger conflict. Putin has already threatened nuclear attacks. So it's really tough. I don't know how it gets resolved. I think that's part of the problem, is that there is no clear path. It's an unprecedented situation with extraordinary violence. We're seeing the Ukrainian people engage in unbelievable resistance and heroism. And they're doing it on their own. And they shouldn't be doing it on their own. But, you know, even I think establishing the no-fly zone would be considered an act of war in this situation, right? Because you can't just have a no-fly zone. You have to patrol it. You have to make sure that it's a no-fly zone. And that would involve, you know, NATO presence. I don't know if this is where we're getting with this, but it would also be interesting to kind of see China's long-term response and whether that shifts over time here, or whether China will kind of step in and provide markets and provide, you know, fill in the kind of vacuum of the sort of that the Western sanctions are creating for Russia. The Kremlin official site is confident that they will have a solution for the Russian people very soon, these sanctions.
Do you have another one online? So based on what you as a scholar know about Putin, what are the chances that he will actually risk or utilize a nuclear option, either small scale or larger global?
Right, so again, I want to start by saying that based on everything that I thought I knew about Putin, I thought that he would not do this, right? Now, looking back, I have to assume he believed his own propaganda to some extent, because part of the civilizational model is this idea that the West is weak and Russia is strong and, you know, has this resolve that the West doesn't have. And then the Ukrainians, there is kind of also prejudice toward Ukrainians and Ukrainian identity, right? This is also kind of ethnic hate here. And he believed that too, because he went in there and he thought it was going to be game over pretty quickly. Like, they were hoping to be out. They were hoping to have had everything by now. Days and days ago, right? So he did not believe that it was going to go this long. I don't think he understood what the nature of the conflict was going to be. And now, I mean, I don't know. Russians, sort of some kind of commentary I've heard from Russians is sort of, you know, they're concerned about him being sort of now destabilized and panicked or something. I don't know. We don't know, right? He's really distanced from everyone. There is displeasure among the oligarchs too, because of course he's affecting their portfolios with this profoundly. I don't know. I mean, nuclear war seems, yeah, I don't know. I don't know how to answer that. I hope not, but we don't, he has already done things that nobody expected him to do.
Thank you. I see that we have a question here, someone over there. Thank you.
The Ukrainian government had announced that they opened a hotline for Russian mothers of soldiers if they wanted information. And it made me think of the Russian NGO that was started in the early 90s regarding human rights violations of the army, and also, was it like hazing of military recruits?
Well, this was, I think, I don't know if it's the same one, but this particular organization too. This is the successor to Memorial, which was the one that was gathering all the information about. You didn't finish your question though.
It was basically just, you know, is this going to be maybe an interesting avenue for, you know, the nonprofit, the NGO sector within Russia to be able to, you know, is it going to be possibly a little bit of a fissure in terms of a way to stand against the government? I mean, the Romanian mothers, or the Russian mothers group has overcome huge crackdowns by the Russian government for years, for decades now, trying to keep up their pressure.
Yeah, no, I mean, I hope so. It's really hard because like this organization that reported on these political reprisals has been under tremendous assault in Russia, and has been basically outlawed, right? So, you know, the law in Russia is such that if you act to support, you know, it might be seen as support of Ukraine, and they would fall under this new law that they made. I also read somewhere that they're talking about, you know, no longer, about having kind of capital punishment again, which, again, it's just, seriously, we had this script already. What are you doing, right? It just feels like this kind of intentional replay of some of the worst historical moments of, you know, the 20th century and earlier. But yeah, I hope so. I just would worry there about funding, right? How do we fund these organizations? Because obviously the government isn't going to support them. Maybe individuals would support them. But foreign funding would be very hard to navigate. I hope so. I mean, I hope we see some change. It's just really hard. It's hard to know. It's hard to predict because we have such fragmentary information from the country and kind of how people are feeling. I think right now they're shell-shocked and trying to figure out what does this mean for me, basically, what am I gonna do? Because again, they're still within this sort of illusion of normalcy, which some of the smartest people that I know there know there's no normal. Like this has done just unimaginable damage to the country, and that will continue to do unimaginable damage to the country the longer it goes on. But I think it's hard for people to sort of grasp that. That awareness is moving slower than we would like to see. I mean, fast by Russia standards, but not. Do you have one on the thing?
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, of course.
I'm just wondering from your perspective, and others who are here can of course chime in too, but as a campus community, what we can, both on an individual level, but also perhaps at this level, you know, where we're providing information on a much broader scale, ways that we can be supportive to students, faculty members, staff who are particularly close to what's going on right now.
Yeah, no, thank you, Emily. I appreciate that question. I mean, a number of ways, right? I mean, I appreciated the statement that came out from the university today. Like, I know Charlie's office has been doing a lot of really good work to get in touch with our local, you know, community members that have strong ties to Ukraine. So I think, you know, I think also our Russian students on campus are struggling and potentially also struggling with the idea of going back and not wanting to and not, you know, being, so I think, you know, I don't know that, you know, necessarily we need to have kind of constant ongoing conversations about it, but I think reaching out and checking in with people, acknowledging what's happening, and, you know, also recognizing that people who aren't from the region, who don't have ties to the region, may be upset about it. I have, you know, there's a lot of emotion right now that we're all sort of experiencing, because we look at this violence and you shouldn't look away from it. You know, I study a Russian author, Fyodor Dostoevsky, who tells us you can't look away from these horrors because it's your moral duty to look at it, right? And I think avoiding it is not helpful. Avoiding the topic at all is not helpful. I think trying to lend support, trying to help students from Ukraine, you know, I think we're all working toward that. And also students from Russia who may not be able to go back. So those are some immediate things that I can think of right now. And I'm grateful to see everyone here today. I'm grateful that we had the rally that we had on Sunday. I'm grateful we had the rally that we had on Saturday in Kansas City. There was over 500 people there. So it all helps.
Thanks. Any other questions here? I think we are 12:58, so maybe it's break time between now and the panel later. So thank you, Dr. Kokobobo.
Thank you.